Hey, how is it going everybody? In this video I've got an updated guide on how to set up a car for drifting in GTA 5. And I made a pretty in-depth video covering how to do this a few months back, but now that the Los Santos Tuners update has dropped, I decided it was time for a revised guide. So in this video I'm going to cover all available modifications and how they affect the driftability of the new tuner vehicles, as well as all of the other cars in the game. I'll also cover how to stance your car and further fine-tune it, so that way you have the absolute best setup for drifting. So really quick disclaimer before we continue with this guide, I am well aware that Rockstar has implemented a nerf for all of the LS tuner cars in the form of a handling flag, which ultimately limits their driftability. I made a discussion video all about this that you can check out if you'd like. Now, this handling change was introduced with the contract DLC when this video was already about 90% done and is still in place at the time that I'm finishing and posting this video. Despite this though, some of the tuner cars can still drift decently, like the Dinka RT3000 shown in this video. Additionally, I have gone back to update this guide and tried to make it a bit more generalized so that most of the information still applies regardless of what handling changes were made or are made in the future to these tuner vehicles. So with that all out of the way, let's quickly go over picking out your drift car. So generally speaking, you're going to have the best experience drifting in a car that's front engine, rear wheel drive, and has decent power. So this means that a lot of cars in the sports and muscle classes will work great, and I've also got some recommendations on screen for you guys to check out depending on your skill level. You can also feel free to take a look at my best drift cars videos for more cars that you can use. Now, because of their high cost and limited driftability as of the contract DLC, I would recommend against using any of the new LS tuner cars and instead try one of the cars that I suggested previously. You can try drifting the new tuner vehicles if you'd like to, but it isn't the easiest to do. Whatever you decide, just don't go out of your way to buy a tuner car specifically for drifting, because you're just going to be pretty disappointed. For those interested, I'll still be showing how to set up the tuner cars for drifting in the hopes that Rockstar eventually fixes their handling. So with that all said, we've now picked out our car, so let's head into the LS car meet and get started with everything. Now, for the sake of keeping this guide as simple as possible, I'm going to first cover all of the necessary upgrades that you should consider for all drift builds. I'll touch on all of the other modifications afterwards. So with that said, the first modification to take a look at is armor. While armor doesn't directly impact performance, it will affect how much damage your car takes in a crash, which could in turn impact its traction and overall handling. The more armor you have, the less damage your car is going to take, so you can upgrade the armor to reduce any adverse handling effects. Upgrading the armor is completely optional though, it's really more about convenience than anything else. The next modification to consider are your brakes. Now, brakes do not have a direct impact on driftability, nor do they affect the strength of the handbrake, but I'd still recommend leaving your brakes stock so that if you do end up using them, for example when you're doing a reverse entry, you're not slowing your car down too much. The next thing you should upgrade is your engine. This is kind of a no-brainer, but more power is going to help your car slide much easier, so definitely upgrade your engine as much as you can. The next modification to talk about are spoilers. For most builds, I'd recommend leaving the spoiler off, otherwise adding one is going to ultimately increase traction and make your car harder to drift. If you really want to, you can run a spoiler on some of those less grippy cars that have stronger tendencies to spin out, so cars like the Bravado Banshee 900R and a couple of the new tuner vehicles, but for most other cases, I'd say it's better just to leave the spoiler off. Another important upgrade to consider is the suspension. Whether or not you do this upgrade depends on the car that you're tuning, so there's two different ways to approach this. I'm going to go over a basic starting point now, but we can fine-tune things later on. So with that in mind, for the new tuner vehicles, upgrading the suspension will actually end up increasing traction and will therefore make it harder to drift your car. So as a starting point, I'd leave the suspension stock so your car is as slippery as possible. Now, for most non-tuner vehicles, upgrading the suspension will actually further reduce traction after you stance your car. If you don't already know what stancing is, don't worry, I'm going to talk about this later on in the video. So anyways, I think a good starting point for these cars is to go for the lowest suspension option possible to make the car as slippery as it can be. Next up, we have the transmission. For this, I'd recommend upgrading the transmission as much as possible, since that increased responsiveness is going to make it quicker and easier for the car to downshift, which is crucial for both low and high-speed drifting. Then we have the turbo. While upgrading the engine first is crucial for any drift build, the turbo is like the icing on the cake and is going to help your car slide much easier, so definitely upgrade it if you've got it unlocked. The last upgrades to consider are in the wheels category. First up, we'll take a look at wheel type. Generally speaking, wheel type has little to no effect on a car's ability to drift. Now, a lot of people in the community believe that both SUV and muscle wheels specifically reduce grip, so you can try these if you'd like. Otherwise, I'd say that most wheels work just fine for drifting. Another crucial thing to consider are tires, more specifically tire enhancements. This upgrade, like the suspension that we covered earlier, largely depends on the car that you're setting up for drifting, so there's two main ways of approaching this. So, for the new tuner vehicles, I would recommend equipping low grip tires as a starting point. Applying these are going to significantly reduce traction and make your car much easier to drift. Luckily enough, they only cost $500, so you can always take them off later if you'd like. Also, do keep in mind that you can only equip low grip tires at the mod shop in the LS car meet. On the other hand, all non-tuner cars do not have access to these low grip tires. In order to make these cars more slippery, we'll rely on stancing them with a weapon later on. But in order to be able to stance a car using that method, it cannot have bulletproof tires. So for all non-tuner vehicles you plan on drifting, just leave the tires stock. So those are all of the modifications that have the most noticeable impacts on a car's overall driftability. Hopefully this makes things a bit easier, as you'll know what upgrades you need to focus on for your next drift build. Now you guys might have noticed that I skipped over all of the visual upgrades, and this is because they have little to no effect on a car's performance or overall driftability. So this means that, besides a spoiler, you have the freedom to choose whatever aesthetic modifications that you'd like for your build. Anyways, with all of these available modifications now covered, let's take our car outside and stance it so that we can start drifting and fine-tuning everything. So I've mentioned stancing a lot throughout this video, mainly because it's another super important step in reducing grip and further enabling a car to drift properly. No matter what type of car you're using for drifting, I'd recommend stancing it so it's as slippery as possible. And how you stance your car depends on whether or not it's one of the new tuner vehicles. So with that in mind, the first method of stancing is extremely easy, and this only applies to the new tuner vehicles. First off, you need to make sure that the tuner car that you plan on stancing is your active personal vehicle. From here, all you need to do is open up your interaction menu, head down to Vehicles, then scroll to Vehicle Stance, and then set it to Lowered. Once you select this option, you should see your car get lowered to the ground. The next method is only applicable to non-tuner vehicles, and this requires the use of a weapon to basically break your car's suspension. Before you start this, do make sure that your car does not have bulletproof tires. Once you've checked that, the first step is to take out a decently powerful weapon, like any pistol, AR, SMG, or sniper rifle. Don't use anything too crazy for this, or else you're just going to end up popping your tire or blowing up your car. Next up, with your weapon of choice, aim into the lower half of the rim, below where the lug nuts are, and start shooting. Do not shoot the tire, only shoot within that lower area of the rim. If you keep shooting in the same spot, you'll eventually see the car drop 2 separate times. If you don't see this, or if your car starts smoking or explodes, you might have to shoot within the fender well or at the bottom portion of the fenders near the back of the tires to stance it properly. Once you've found the spot where you need to shoot to stance your car, repeat this process for all of the other wheels. And once you're done, your car should be noticeably lower to the ground and will feel very slippery when driving. One important note here is that not all non-tuner cars can be stanced using this method. In order to check to see if a car can be stanced in the first place, and also to find out where you need to shoot to stance it, I'd recommend starting up a race and setting the type to GTA so that way you can use your weapons, and then try stancing your car in there. That way, it's no big deal if your car explodes, and you can keep practicing until you get it right. Anyways, at this point, your car has all of the right upgrades and it's also stanced, so you're good to start drifting and refining your setup. So earlier on, when we upgraded and stanced our car, I recommended that a good starting point was to make your car as slippery as possible to maximize its drifting potential. However, depending on the car and your drifting style, this isn't always the best approach. Sometimes your car might be way too slippery and ends up needing more grip so that it just handles better. And this is where fine tuning comes into play, and there's different ways to approach this for both tuner and non-tuner cars. Before we start though, I'd recommend getting some practice in your car so you know what you want to change. For the new tuner vehicles, the two main things I recommend playing around with are the low grip tires and the lowered stance, as these two things have the largest effect on traction. Now, given the recent handling changes that Rockstar has made to these cars, you'll probably find yourself just keeping on both the low grip tires and the lowered stance for most of your builds, otherwise they're going to be pretty hard to drift. However, if Rockstar goes back to fix the handling of these cars, or if you just want more of a detailed process on how to fine tune, I will cover that now. For some cars, combining the low grip tires and the lowered stance can reduce traction too much to the point that the car is just really hard to control. In these instances, I'd first recommend changing the stance back to default using the interaction menu as I showed earlier. Then you can see if just the low grip tires are enough for your setup. However, if you're still finding the car hard to control with just the low grip tires, then remove these tires and set the stance back to lowered to see how the car handles. Following these steps and testing different combinations of tires and stance should allow you to find a great drifting setup for most of the new tuner cars that you won't have to play around with much further. However, if you still want to make some finer adjustments, you can apply the maximum suspension upgrade if you find yourself needing more grip and you want the car to handle slightly better. If changing the suspension doesn't help as much as you'd like, and you find yourself needing even more grip, then you can consider adding a spoiler. I personally found that most of the new tuner vehicles were fine to drift without a spoiler, but if you think it helps handling, then feel free to run one. Now, for non-tuner vehicles, the only two things I'd change when fine-tuning your car are the suspension and/or the spoiler. After you stance your car, if it feels too slippery with the low suspension, you can progressively raise the suspension back up to see how it affects traction and overall handling. While raising the suspension has a slight negative effect on handling, it can help to slightly increase traction. Like I talked about with the tuner vehicles, if the suspension upgrades don't help as much as you'd like them to, you can then consider adding a spoiler if you absolutely need more grip. Normally I'd recommend against this, but it might end up working for you. Beyond playing around with the suspension height and deciding whether or not to run a spoiler, there's not much other fine tuning you can do with the non-tuner class vehicles. So hopefully after spending some time practicing with your car and fine-tuning it using the steps that I just talked about, you should be able to find the absolute best drifting setup for your car. Now if you guys are looking to find example drift setups for most of the new tuner cars, as well as some of the more popular non-tuner drift cars, feel free to check the description of this video as I've left some there for your reference. Anyways guys, that will conclude my updated tuning and stancing guide for GTA 5 drifting. Hopefully I've given you guys enough of a base so that you'll be able to set up and fine tune most drift cars in this game. As always, if you guys found this video helpful, feel free to drop a like on it, leave any feedback or questions that you might have down in the comments, and also consider subscribing to my channel for more GTA 5 drifting content coming very soon. Thank you all so much for watching and have an awesome day.